When Hitler came to power, everything started to change. My mother woke up on the morning of the 10th.
I went to Prinzregentenstraße where our synagogue was, and I saw it burning.
All of the synagogues were burned. I'm Lyn Hill, and I live in Brooklyn, New York. So my mother was born in Berlin in 1923. Her name then was Erika Lange, Erika with a K. She later became Erika with a C when she came to the United States, and then became Erika Stiefel when she married my father. And eventually, after he died and she remarried, she became Erika Gorin. My mother talked about her childhood a great deal because I think until she was 10 at least, it was a very happy childhood. A lot of the time, she was being raised by a nanny or a maid. They spent a lot of time at the Berlin Zoo, which she loved. The Berlin Zoo is very famous, I think, even now. It's a place where there is not only animals that you can see, but also there are playgrounds and parks. That was one aspect of her childhood that she remembered very fondly.
I always brought some food for the animals, and I wanted to bring some matzah along. The maid told me, I cannot take matzah along. And I asked her why not. And she said, because the animals are not Jewish. And at that time I was very unhappy about it.
Erika Sarah Lange. Sarah was not her middle name, but the Germans insisted that every female Jew add Sarah as a middle name. They didn't, try to hide the fact that they were Jewish. I think her father, even after the Nazis came to power, her father would practice blowing the shofar. She said that when her father went to synagogue, she was always very proud of how he looked. He was so handsome, and he wore a top hat, and he said to her, walk very straight and be proud that you're a Jew. Kristallnacht was a pogrom. It was engineered by the German administration. It was a night when German shops were trashed, windows were broken into, stores were burned. Many Jewish men were arrested and taken to camps, and all of the synagogues were burned. And my mother had very, very vivid memories of Kristallnacht. My mother was staying with her grandmother, who lived very near their synagogue.
On the 10th of November in the morning, I went to Prinzregentenstraße where our synagogue was, and I saw it burning.
There were firemen there, but they were there only to see that the fire did not spread to any adjoining buildings. They just let the synagogue itself burn.
And I saw people around and standing around, and people were rejoicing. And I saw mothers holding their children high to show them the beautiful thing that the synagogue was burning.
She said she just stood there with tears running down her cheeks because the synagogue had been very important to her and had been a place of comfort during all of those years.
I was devastated, and I was crying.
She ran back to her grandmother's house to tell her what was happening, and her grandmother already knew that and was concentrating on hiding the men in the family so they wouldn't be arrested.
Most of the people who were picked up at that time were released after about 6 or 8 weeks, but when they were released, their heads were shorn, and they were in pretty bad condition.
The Kindertransport was established just after the major pogrom that was Kristallnacht, and England agreed to take an unspecified number of unaccompanied children from Germany and Austria and some other countries that were being particularly threatened by Nazi regulations. I think eventually about 10,000 children were transported from those countries to England, over a period of several months. My mother and her younger brother left Berlin in January of 1939, which was about 2 months after Kristallnacht, and they went to England by the train and then eventually the boat that took them to Harwich, England. Unlike many of the other children on the transport, they were actually met by relatives. They had 2 uncles who were living there already with their families and had agreed to care for the children.
The relief fund growing, there come from Germany boatloads of Jewish youngsters to be given the protection and education denied them at home.
It was originally, I think the plan was for the whole family to go to England, but my mother's father had a very serious stroke and was too sick to travel. That was why they sent the children ahead on the Kindertransport. This is quilt 2, and this is the quilt that the square about my mother appears in. People were asked to submit squares of a certain size, probably inspired by the AIDS quilts that were being made at that time. And this is the square. She was then in England for about 9 months. She later told me that was the most unhappy period of her entire life. She was very lonely. She had expected that she would be able to continue her high school education in England, but when she arrived, her uncles told her that she would be needing to earn a living. She was 15 at that time, and so they instead enrolled her in a commercial course where she learned shorthand and typing. Eventually, her parents did arrive in England. Her father was very sick by that time, and I guess they decided to send the children, my mother and her younger brother, to America because their visa numbers had come up and they could go. They actually knew that her father would not be alive to go to the United States. She and her brother went to the hospital and they said goodbye to their parents, particularly to their father, and then they boarded a train for Liverpool, then got on a Cunard boat called the Antonia. Eventually they anchored in Montreal. They were interned for a little while at a Jewish organization in Montreal and then got on a train to New York City. They ended up in Penn Station and they were met by some very distant relatives who had provided the affidavit of support for the 2 children. And they then took them by subway to their apartment in Washington Heights. She talked about being tremendously impressed by the subway and how fast it went and how the people swayed back and forth when they were standing on the subway. And then when she saw the apartment, she was a little bit shocked because it was only 3 rooms. She thought, it seemed to her to be a tremendously small apartment. And in fact, they had put a cot in the kitchen for her brother to sleep. And she thought she would be able to get a job as a secretary. And they told her that wasn't going to be possible. Got a job as a kind of a nursemaid, nanny, but also required to do a certain amount of household tasks when the child was taking a nap. She was very lonely because she was living in this Upper West Side brownstone, taking care of a toddler. She was expected to take the child out for 2 hours in the fresh air every day, no matter what the weather. And she did admit that sometimes she would take the child to the 5 and 10 and walk up and down the aisles to keep warm, or go to the Museum of Natural History with her. So she found ways to keep warm. After several months, I think she got a cable from her mother telling her that her father had died. And that wasn't unexpected, but it was still very devastating. And she had no one to share the grief with. When her mother finally arrived in New York, Her mother rented a small apartment in Inwood, and the two children were able to move in with her, and so the family, whatever was left of the family, was reunited. And at that point, my mother was able to get a secretarial job. You know, the Jews in Germany, when Hitler first came to power, they didn't really know how long he would be in power, but in 1937, I guess, things started to change. My father was 24 at that point, and he had a good job with a clothing manufacturing company that was owned by Jews. And it became clear that they were going to have to sell their business to Aryans, and that he would lose his job. And so there was a recognition that there was no future for him. He came on, I don't know the name of the ship, but it was part of the United States line, and my uncle once told me that he did not want to go on a German ship. The relatives lived in Brooklyn, but they had secured a job for him in a ladies' handbag factory as a stock clerk, and they had also found him a furnished room in Washington Heights. Washington Heights was then known, I think, as Frankfurt on the Hudson. Well, once my mother was living with her own mother and her brother again, and had a secretarial job, she went to a party that was given by the New World Club, which was a refugee organization. It happened to be a Halloween party, and she met my father there. I guess established a relationship pretty quickly because that was Halloween. By Christmas, they were engaged and they got married on Valentine's Day. I think that their lives were radically different from what they had been in Germany and what they probably had expectations they would be when they were growing up. In both cases, the Nazi regime interrupted those expectations, and they really had to remake themselves when they came here. They had 3 daughters. I was the oldest. I think partly in reaction to all the things that had happened to her after Hitler came to power, her main goal was to make us feel secure and supported and very much loved. And she had a great sense of humor. She also wanted to instill a lot of independence in us. She encouraged us to make up our minds about what we wanted to do and to pursue our goals. Education was one of their most important values. The house was filled with books. Even in Inwood, when the apartment was so small, and we also went to the library regularly. And my parents had subscriptions to the Philharmonic, and when my father was home, there was always classical music on the radio, and they went to Broadway plays, even if they had to sit in the highest balcony. My mother and father actually joined a synagogue and I was raised in that synagogue too, that had been founded by German Jewish refugees in the mid-1930s. We were very much tied to the synagogue. We all went during the holidays, and especially the high holidays. So all of the people who belonged to that synagogue had this German Jewish background. Her high school was interrupted. She never completed high school, and then she had this commercial course, and that was it. And that was it for many, many years. Her second husband really didn't want her to work, and she didn't need to work, and he encouraged her to spend her time and go back to school. So she got a GED first. That was a little difficult because she had to reckon with math, which had always been a difficult subject for her, but she eventually passed the GED exam. She entered the adult continuing education program at Queens College, and 4 years later she graduated with a bachelor's in comparative literature, summa cum laude, Phi Beta Kappa, and she even did 2 years of graduate school. She graduated college in 1977, so she must have been, about 53 at that point. She was almost 99 years old when she died. To me, her defining characteristic was resilience. She just eventually bounced back from every situation, and I guess I assumed that the early experiences provided that resource of resilience. I mean, she lost my father when she was in her early 40s. He died very young. She eventually lost her second husband as well. She lost my middle sister to cancer. I mean, these were all, tragedies that she endured and grieved very deeply, but bounced back and continued to be a very productive and basically optimistic person. I think she did a lot of processing through writing. She was an extraordinary writer, and she wrote for her entire life. She wrote this little book of poems and stories that she, between the ages of 12 and 14. This is the little book that she rediscovered after 70 years. It must have been in the suitcase when she left on the Kindertransport. There's also a place where quite a number of pages have been torn out, and I think that must have been pages that she didn't want anybody to see, and whether that was because it was very private thoughts or whether it was because it openly criticized the Nazis, I don't know. She translated all of the poems so that and stories so that her grandchildren could understand what it was like for a 12 to 14-year-old girl growing up in Nazi times. The German rhymes, but she didn't bother to make the English rhymes. So this one is called The Eternal Wanderer. Do you see the old bent-over man? Sorrow oppresses and torments him, and always follows him. It paints deep wrinkles in his face. I asked the old man, "Who are you?" He sadly said, "I am the wanderer, Israel. I wander from country to country. If I am happy in a country, I am pushed out again. I am pushed out from every country. I am called the Eternal Jew." I've always been extremely proud of being a New Yorker. I've always thought that it was the best place in the world to grow up and to live, and I think I've had a good life in New York. I love the fact that it's a city of immigrants, a city that essentially made it possible for my family to live a good life here and for my parents to actually reinvent themselves. It's home.